Welcome to Pivot to Profit, where personal growth meets business strategy, and I'm your host, TaVia Woolley. Before we get into today's episode, I want to give you some context. What you're listening to right now is part of a series. Over the course of these episodes, I am taking you on a full journey through the mindset work that built my foundation, the environments that shaped my growth, the strategies that expanded my vision, the mistakes that cost me over $300,000, and ultimately the personal blueprint I'm using to close the gaps and evolve into the next season. Each episode stands on its own, but together they tell a complete story. And this is where it begins. Because before we can talk strategy, before we could talk systems, and you know I love systems, before we could talk about what it costs to get things wrong, we have to talk about how you think. Everything I've built, every pivot I've made, and every decision that moved me forward, it was informed by the way I think. And the way I think was shaped in large part by the books I chose to study. I use the word study intentionally, not read, but study. There is a difference. Reading gets you information, but studying changes how you operate. Today, I'm sharing the 5 books I return to consistently, not because I forgot what they say, but because every stage of my life reveals something new in them. Every time I revisit them, I don't just gain knowledge, I refine how I think, how I lead, and how I make decisions. These are the books that built my thinking. So let's get into it. First book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. I read this book in my early 20s when I was actively trying to grow as a professional. And what struck me immediately is that this book is not just like a business book. It's a character development book disguised as a business book. That combination is still rare to this day. Most productivity books teach you how to do more. This one teaches you how to prioritize what actually moves your life forward versus what simply feels urgent in the moment. That distinction alone changed how I operate. But the habit that fundamentally shifted my thinking was this: begin with the end in mind. That one principle reshaped how I make every major decision. Instead of reacting to life as it happens, I started asking, what outcome am I building toward? What does the end result need to look like? What decisions today align with that outcome? It doesn't mean you don't adjust along the way. Life simply requires that. But it means you don't have to drift. You move with intention, and there's an enormous difference between those two things. I still apply this principle today in business planning, in leadership, and in personal decisions. In fact, this book has influenced me so deeply that I now teach workshops on it for community leadership. And I actually like to give this book out to people at random places. When a book becomes curriculum, you know it did something permanent. So here's some of the lessons I want to share from this book. Effectiveness is not about doing more. It's about doing the right things, the things that are aligned with where you are actually trying to go. Without a clear end in mind, you can stay busy for years and still be standing in the same place. So here's some action steps for you. Pick one goal you are currently working toward. Write down what the end results look like in specific, concrete terms. Not, I'll grow my business, but what does that growth actually produce? Ask, what habits would the version of me who has already achieved this have? Start practicing one of those habits this week. Identify where you're currently reactive rather than intentional. What would change if you applied begin with the end in mind to that area? All right, so book number 2, The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. This is one of those books that gets recommended in very specific circles. Think podcast bros. And I want to be clear about how I engage with it, because how you read this book matters as much as reading it. So let me tell you a story. I was introduced to it in my early career, around 22, right after I had been promoted into a role that was uncommon for someone at my experience and age level. Instead of support, I encountered tension and resentment from my colleagues. Someone who presented themselves as a mentor recommended this book to me. What I later understood was that that same person had competing intentions and was actively using tactics from the book to undermine me professionally. That experience was deeply painful, and it was educational in ways I didn't expect. But I really want to emphasize that it was deeply painful. I made a decision. Instead of discarding the book that was recommended to me, I studied it differently. Not to replicate manipulation, but to understand it. Because here's what I have learned. Power exists whether you acknowledge it or not. People are always navigating influence, perception, and positioning, even in the most subtle ways. In every room, in every organization, and in every collaboration. And if you're not paying attention, you will be on the losing end of dynamics you didn't even know were in play. Studying this book taught me to read the rooms, see who is actually influencing outcomes, to recognize when positioning is happening and make strategic decisions about how to protect my work and my credibility. There is a version of this knowledge that becomes weaponized. I don't operate from that version. I use it for awareness, for protection, and for discernment. And that discernment, as you'll hear later in this series, has become one of the most important skills I have. So here are the lessons I learned. Naivete in professional spaces is costly. You don't need to become manipulative to protect yourself, but you do need to understand how power and influence operate so you can navigate them with clarity and intention. This week, pay deliberate attention to the power dynamics in your professional environments. Who is influencing decisions? How? What is the gap between what is being said and what is actually happening? Identify one area where your credibility or positioning could be stronger. What would it look like to be more intentional there? Consider where you may have been too trusting or too transparent in a professional relationship. What does that situation teach you about discernment going forward? So, book number 3, Battlefield of the Mind by Joyce Meyer. This is a Christian-based book, and I want to acknowledge that up front. But I believe the principles extend far beyond religion, and I've applied them in deeply practical ways throughout my career. I read it as a teenager around 16 or 17, and the central idea is one I still live by today. Your mind is the primary battlefield of your life. Thoughts don't stay thoughts. If left unchecked, they grow. They shape emotions, and emotions shape decisions, which means what you allow into your mental space has direct consequences for the choices you make and the results you produce. This is why I become so intentional about what I consume, whether it's podcasts, conversations, environments, and the energy of the people around me. I learned this in a visceral way doing a job interview. Before I walked in, I overheard a negative conversation about the interviewer. I wasn't part of it. I didn't participate, but just hearing it changed my internal state. I walked into that interview anxious and reactive in a way that wasn't natural for me. I had to actively reset myself in that moment before I could perform. That experience taught me something I've never forgotten. Even passive exposure to negativity can alter your mindset. You don't have to engage with toxic energy for it to affect you. Proximity is simply enough, which means protecting your mental environment is not optional, it's strategic. Not everything deserves access to your attention. Not every conversation deserves your participation. And not every opinion deserves influence over your direction. And before you think it's arrogance, let's just call it discipline. So here are the lessons I learned. The content of your mind becomes the architecture of your life. Guard your inputs with the same intentionality you bring to your most important business decisions. The two are not separate. So here's some action steps. Audit your daily inputs this week. What are you listening to? What conversations are you staying in that you shouldn't be? What content are you consuming that contradicts the direction you're trying to build toward? Identify one source of mental noise, whether it's a relationship, a social media account, a reoccurring conversation, and make a decision about limiting it or removing it altogether. Begin a simple morning mental discipline. Before you check your phone or consume any external content, spend 5 minutes setting the tone of your own thinking. Write one intention for the day. You cannot guard a battlefield you haven't surveyed. Book number 4, The 360-Degree Leader by John Maxwell. Leadership has been part of my identity for as long as I can remember. I was the kid who said she wanted to be president of the United States of America. No surprise there, right? Leadership development wasn't something I came to later in life. It was something that was always a thread throughout my life. What I love about this book is what it dismantles. It removes the myth that leadership requires a title. Maxwell teaches that you can lead upward, sideways, and downward, regardless of your position on an organizational chart. Leadership is influence. And influence doesn't wait for permission. When I internalized this, everything shifted. I stopped waiting to be given authority before I led. I stopped shrinking in rooms where I didn't have a formal title. I showed up as a leader in every context I was in, and ironically, that is exactly what led to more formal leadership opportunities. Because when people see leadership in action, they don't need to be convinced. You simply become the obvious choice. This applies whether or not you ever want a leadership title. Because here's the secret. You are already influencing someone. Your family, your team, your community, or yourself. The question is whether you're doing it with intention. So here's a lesson I learned. You don't need permission to lead. Waiting for a title before you step into your influence is one of the most expensive forms of self-limitation. Your leadership is already happening. The question is whether you are directing it. So here's some action steps. Identify one place in your current work or life where you could lead more effectively. What would that look like in practice this week? Think about who you are influencing right now, whether you intended to or not. Are you influencing them in a direction you actually want them to go? If not, what needs to shift? Where are you underestimating your leadership impact? Write it down. Then ask, what would it look like to stop underestimating it? Book number 5, StrengthsFinder by Gallup. This one changed how I see myself, and that is not a small thing. StrengthsFinder is both a book and an assessment, a tool that helps you identify your top 5 natural strengths. I've taken it multiple times over the years, and every time my results have been consistent. That consistency used to confuse me. Now I understand what it was telling me. That wasn't repetition, that was identity. My strengths aren't random skills I developed, they are patterns. Deep, reoccurring patterns that show up across every context. How I think, how I create, how I solve problems, and how I build relationships. One of my strongest themes is strategy. I see connections quickly and translate them into action plans. But for a long time, I thought something was wrong with me because not everyone saw the things I was seeing. I was trying to operate more like the people around me instead of more like myself. StrengthsFinder interrupted that. It gave me language for what I was doing naturally. And once I had that language, I stopped trying to fix myself and started leveraging myself instead. I now focus my energy in my zone of genius. I build systems around my weaknesses instead of exhausting myself fighting. And just so you know, I'm a certified StrengthsFinder coach. Yeah, which means I get to help other people have the same shift, to see what they've been overlooking about themselves, to stop minimizing what comes easily and start building around it. So here are my lessons learned. You will always outperform in your zone of genius. The goal is not to become well-rounded. The goal is to identify your natural patterns, amplify them, and build infrastructure around the gaps. Leveraging yourself is always more profitable than fixing yourself. So here are some action steps. If you haven't taken a StrengthsFinder assessment, that is your first action step. Take it, get your top 5 results, sit with them. Identify the work you do that feels most effortless to you, but produces high value for others. That is likely a strength in disguise, so name it. Ask yourself honestly, Am I currently building my business and my daily work around my strengths? Or am I spending most of my energy trying to compensate for my weaknesses? The answer tells you where to restructure. Here's what I want you to take from all of this. You do not become successful simply by working harder. You become successful by thinking differently. In books, when you actually study and apply them, are one of the most efficient ways to upgrade how you think. But I want to be clear about something. Information alone does not change your life. Application does. Every book I share today has a corresponding action in my life. A decision it informed, a pattern it interrupted, a behavior it changed. That's the standard I'm inviting you to hold. Don't just collect books. Don't just admire them. Work them. Because in the next episode of this series, we're going to talk about the spaces you inhabit every day and how your environment is either growing you or holding you back. What you'll discover is that the books you choose to study and the environments you choose to live and work in are not separate conversations. They are part of the same architecture. So here's this week's pivot challenge. Choose one book from today's list, just one, not 5. 1. Then do 3 things. Read or revisit one chapter this week with a highlighter and a notebook. Identify the one idea from that chapter that is most relevant to where you are right now. Write down one specific action you will take based on that idea and assign it a deadline. Don't admire the book, work it. I want to leave you with some reflection questions just to make sure we're hitting home the point. What book has had the most significant impact on how you think? And when did I last return to it? Where in your professional or personal life are you still operating from old thinking that a new book or idea could interrupt? Are you reading to collect knowledge or studying to change your behavior? What's the difference in your life right now? As I always like to say, action creates momentum. Momentum builds confidence, and confidence changes how you show up in your business and your life. Thank you for spending time with me today. Until next time, keep pivoting with purpose. Y'all be easy.